like to ask you about this. Okay, so you saw this icon and you said it stood out. So that phenomenon of standing out for you, that's really interesting in and of itself. I mean, so if you're a Jungian psychologist, you would say, well, your future self announces itself to you by making things around you now stand out. And so you think, well, with this impetus to further development, well, how do you develop further? Well, you pursue that which catches your interest. Well, what makes something catch your interest? Well, that's the spirit Mercurius from a Jungian perspective. That's Mercury, the winged messenger of the gods, who exists in the divine world, but also in the profane world and brings messages from one realm to the other. Well, you think, well, that's, many of the mainstream critics of my books have been ragging on me, let's say, because I wrote extensively about Harry Potter. And, I think one of them said I sounded like a stoned undergraduate, which I thought was pretty funny and maybe even true.
Hey there, welcome to Cancel This. I'm your host, Angelo Isidoro, and today we have a massive episode. Dr. Jordan B. Peterson is a clinical psychologist and an author. He's written 12 Rules for Life, and now he has a new book out called Beyond Order. You can see it right behind me here. I've read it. I love it. I highly recommend it. And I highly recommend listening to our conversation. We dive into the book. We talk about a few different chapters. It was a really great conversation, and it was great connecting with him after all these years. I hosted Dr. Peterson when I was in university at UBC, and it was really one of the highlights of my university time. So it's really great to see him again, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Have a listen. Dr. Peterson, thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Well, we go back a few ways. I mean, I hosted you when I was at UBC back in the early days when you were first starting out on your incredible journey. So it's really great to see you again and catch up. The first time I'd hosted you, it was for 12 Rules for Life. Now you've written and you've published Beyond Order. I've read it. I love it. And I think it's a great contrast to, it's a great completion of sort of the yin and the yang of order and chaos. So just to jump right in, my first question is, to what degree are the rules in Beyond Order inspired by everything that's happening around us, if at all? Because I know you wrote a lot of these rules way back when, but so much of it is applicable. Have any of these rules been born out of what's happened in your life or what's happening in the current culture?
Well, I don't think the rules themselves were, because I actually wrote them in a burst in a very short period of time, in some sense on a whim. I was on the website Quora, and I had been experimenting with it, answering questions. And someone asked me about, some young person didn't ask me, but asked in general about guidelines for life. What should everyone know? What should every young person know, I think was the gist of the question. And I wrote down these 42 rules, and they all at once, and they were popular on Quora, disproportionately popular in relationship to all my other answers, and then also in terms of absolute popularity too. So that was interesting. I wasn't sure exactly what to make of it. Maybe that people like lists, that's a possibility, but the feedback on them was very positive. And then I selected 12 for the first book, 12 Rules for Life, and then another 12 for Beyond Order. That selection process, of course, was informed by my interest in everything that's going on now, and also my own personal interests. And then, of course, writing them was colored. The content of what I was writing was definitely colored by current events, let's say. So that was one source for them, but not the only one. I drew a lot from my clinical practice. I drew a lot from my studies of mythology and symbolism from the psychoanalytic perspective. And so it's a meld of all those things.
Well, something that stood out as a highlight for me was Rule 11, where, try to make your one room in your house as beautiful as possible, because you even stipulate that cleaning your room is not everything, which I think may even come as a shock to some of the followers. And if you'll indulge me, I took that advice in the first book and in general, not only philosophically but very practically. And what I noticed is that when I cleaned my room, so to speak, it ended up being very empty, just out of being hyper organized and getting rid of clutter. So I think, you raised this point about art, that is so important. Do you feel that, especially conservatives seem to have a vacuum when it comes to interest in art and literature? If you're someone who is conscientious, how can you overcome that? Can you overcome that? Can you overcome your sort of rigid nature if you are someone who's conscientious?
Okay, so that's rule 8, right? Try to make one room in your home as beautiful as possible. And it was partly put in the second book as a extension of clean up your room before you attempt to clean up the world. And you discussed your adoption of that philosophically as well as practically. And I don't think that those two things are really different, at least it's at one important level of analysis. Um, it's a philosophical act to put your room in order, not least because you have to decide what to keep and what to eliminate, and you have to decide where to put everything and why. And so your room is saturated with value decisions, and every value decision is a reflection, at least, of your implicit philosophical hierarchy, and hopefully to some degree of your explicit philosophical hierarchy. And because it's that hierarchy, implicit and explicit, that determines your value decisions. So you can't clean up your room without doing it philosophically. Now, you might not be able to state explicitly why you made all the decisions that you did, although you might be able to state some of them. And so I noticed in my clinical practice, and this is one of the real strengths of the behavioral approach. I'm very interested in psychoanalytic thinking, but with most of my clients, I never did symbolic therapy, let's say. I didn't do dream analysis. We didn't pursue the meaning of meta narratives. With some of them, I did, but those would have been the more creative people. And they were interested in that sort of thing. And they were also likely to fantasize, to read fiction, and to have a very active dream life. But with many of my clients, and this was also in some sense independent of their intellectual ability, that was just a non-starter. And I noticed that when I was teaching too. Some people ate up the mythological / symbolic material, and some people were much more attracted to the bare bones practical behavioral approach. And I always started with my clients with the behavioral approach. Do something, change something that you're acting out. Okay, so let's say you put your room in order. Well, that's good, but you said yourself, well, your room was kind of bare once you made it efficient. And efficiency and charm have an uneasy relationship with one another, and so do efficiency and beauty. If you think about them as informed by conscientiousness and openness, they're actually somewhat separate, right? Because the 5 dimensions of personality are pretty independent, not entirely. Like extroversion and openness clump together, and agreeableness, conscientiousness, and emotional stability clump together. The first 2 would be plasticity, exploration, and the second would be something like stability. But you asked if you could be conscientious and have an eye for beauty, and you certainly can. You can be conscientious and open. That's somewhat less likely because it doesn't matter. That it's certainly it's a temperamental. It's a form of temperament that definitely exists. That would confuse you politically because your conscientiousness would tilt you towards a conservative and traditional outlook, but your openness would tilt you towards more radical, revolutionary, and more liberal ideas. And then there'd be an additional influence of trait agreeableness, so that breaks down into compassion and politeness. And if you're compassionate, you tend to tilt more towards the liberal end of things. And if you're polite, you tend to tilt more towards the conservative end of things. So now, but so I would say you can be conscientious and love art. It might be, and I don't know this, and I don't think anybody's ever done the research. I suspect that conscientious people who love art likely like art that's more structured.
So
Maybe
not
they're not so much
abstract.
in, well, some abstract is very structured. Mondrian, for example, it's all rectangles and cubes and lines, unbelievably carefully done. Maybe you wouldn't like abstract expressionism, which tends to be more emotive and also more messy in a technical sense, visual sense. Um, if you're low in openness, can you develop an aesthetic sensibility? And I would say with difficulty, you're pushing against your temperament. You might be able to convince yourself that there's something there that's of value that you don't understand. And maybe if you can see glimmerings of aesthetic interest, you might develop it. And then you could put some effort into it too and see what happens. I mean, I'll give you an example. Um, I bought these paintings for my father about 15 years ago, and they were Russian Impressionist paintings, um, uh, which I thought were of very high quality. The Russian Impressionism is a lot rougher than French Impressionism. It's not as pretty. The brush strokes are rougher and harsher. Um, my father really liked the paintings, and my mother didn't like them at all. In fact, she wouldn't let him hang them in in the upstairs of our house. So they stayed in the basement for a while, but he got nice frames for them, and then he put one up, and then he put a bunch of them up, and now she doesn't even remember disliking them. She really likes them. So, and she's more conservative. She's conscientious and lower in openness. And so for her, art is quite shocking to her. It has too much of an impact. And she used to come over to my house, which was completely covered with paintings. And I mean, completely. Every square inch had a painting on it, even the ceiling. And she said, I just can't understand why anyone would want to live in a museum. And I would think, well, that's exactly where I want to live. But that's a minority taste. Who knows how much you can teach yourself in a direction that's antithetical to your personality? You can certainly teach yourself some. I've seen agreeable people learn to stand up for themselves. I've seen disagreeable people learn to be more empathetic and centered on others. That does happen more and more as you age. And so I think, your temperament in some sense is the talents that you were born with, or the proclivities that you were born with. God only knows how much will can move that, will and practice. But you have to build it from the bottom up, and it's effortful. I've seen very unconscientious people become conscientious as well by will.
Yeah, and it seems like there's some beauty in that. I mean, specifically even with this chapter, again, going back to 12 Rules for Life, a lot of us got our life in order, cleaned our room, became more disciplined. And the addition of art in life, one would initially think is sort of insignificant or purely aesthetic. But as I introduced art, whether it is icons, or I know you like indigenous art, I know you like Jonathan Pajot's art, you have a sculpture. I mean, something happens to you that is difficult to define. I mean, how would you define the inspiration that one feels from art? I mean, you mentioned your mother.
Well, if it's real art, it throws you outside of your preconceptions. And look, I'm glad we're talking about this chapter, because it's actually my favorite chapter in the book,
Yeah.
and maybe in both books.
It's my favorite as well.
Oh, good, good. I'm glad to hear that, and I think it addresses something of crucial importance, which is, well, what exactly is the role of art? And art speaks to you of that which you still do not know, and maybe never can know. Like if it's a particularly great piece of art. I mean, you listen to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony or the Brandenburg Concertos, some classic, uh, some classical piece that has the capacity to send shivers up your spine. It invokes a sense of awe. And with music, that's particularly mysterious. I created this piece of art called The Meaning of Music, which you can, it was interesting because when I created it, I thought, well, I'd like to see how many places I could get this duplicated. That was an intuition. And that was back in 1985, 86 when I made that. I thought, I'm going to try to get this duplicated everywhere. I'm going to see how many different variants I can make it manifest, and it's everywhere now. So it's so interesting. But I was trying to understand music when I made that piece of art, and I made this visual piece that moves when you look at it, and it moves like a Necker cube moves. A Necker cube is one of those cubes that reverses when you look at it, and meaning of music is a Necker cube on steroids in some sense, because it's so complex visually and plays with perspective so much that you just keep moving it when you look at it because it doesn't resolve. And music is like that, right? It continually transforms. It stays in the same place essentially, but continually transforms. So music speaks of transforming patterns. And I think it gets to the root of what existence is, because existence is transforming patterns. And so in some mysterious way, music speaks to you of the essence of existence, the essence of being itself. And it puts you in touch with the divine. And and that's independent of your conception of the divine, and it's also independent of your belief in the divine. It does that regardless. Now that's assuming that you're sensitive to music, and people differ in that, but virtually everyone has a genre and at least a few pieces within that genre that do that for them. It also tends to speak to them of their identity, right? Because music seems to catalyze our identities somewhere in late adolescence. And having a piece of art in your house is a dangerous venture if it's really a piece of art, because it it pulls you past where you are. And they're very, pieces of art are very strange because they have a life in them as well. So you get attached to them across time, and I think part of the reason for that is that, like, I went to the National Museum in Canada, National Gallery, and there's this one wall that's covered with uh, little paintings about 12, 9 by 12, 10 by 14, something like that, maybe 50 of them in an array, and they're all sunsets or sunrises done by one of the group of seven. And I've had this experience with impressionism quite frequently. I was standing in front of the paintings, and they weren't doing much for me to begin with, and then all of a sudden one sort of popped, and I thought, well, that one's really got something. It was started to glow, and then another one did the same thing, and then another one did the same thing, and all of a sudden all of these paintings came to life as I looked at them. And what was happening was that my mind was using everything I knew about sunsets to build the image, and the artist had evoked enough sunset structure to activate my memory, and so I could fill in the gaps. And so what I was perceiving was actually, literally, I was perceiving the interaction between me and the artist. That's where the art was. It wasn't on the canvas, and it wasn't in me. It was in the space in between. And because it's a collaborative endeavor to observe and perceive a work of art, it starts to become yours personally. And you can see that with music too. Like, I listen to dinosaur rock because I'm old. And, you know, when you first hear a piece of music, well, maybe you don't even like it because it's too novel. And then you learn to understand it a bit. And if it's, just a pop song, 3 or 4 listens and you're done with it. But if it's got some depth, you can listen to it a lot. But then if you listen to it over the course of your life, it starts to take on levels and levels of memory, because it starts to evoke all the times that you've listened to that music and everything that was happening in the culture at that time. And so it becomes richer and richer in some sense as it travels through time. And you might say, well, that's not the music, that's the observer. But separating the observer from the music is no simple thing. It's like beauty, like, where exactly is beauty? Is that in the eye of the beholder, or is that something that's intrinsic to the thing that's being observed? It's some interaction. It's some participatory interaction.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it seems that way. I mean, beyond music, it seems that way with literature. It seems that way even on some level with scripture. In my younger years, I would read Job or Ecclesiastes and feel nothing. And yet there's these strange moments where you look at something, whether it is scripture or Dostoevsky or whatever, and something changes in you. It does glow like you describe. And it's, I bring this up because the chapter in this book affected me in a profound way because, I've been, again, my wall has been bare and I've been seeing what kind of art I'd like to get. And I've been looking at icons because I'm Orthodox Christian. And one in particular called Christ Creating the Universe glowed and stood out to me. And now I have it and it's on my wall and it's sort of part of my room identity. So without going on to the point on and on, I feel like that chapter in particular, even for those listening, it's very important.
Now you should go on and on. I'd like to ask you about this. Okay, so you saw this icon and you said it stood out. So that phenomenon of standing out for you, that's really interesting in and of itself. I mean, so if you're a Jungian psychologist, you would say, well, your future self announces itself to you by making things around you now stand out. And so you think, well, with this impetus to further development, well, how do you develop further? Well, you pursue that which catches your interest. Well, what makes something catch your interest? Well, that's the spirit Mercurius from a Jungian perspective. That's Mercury, the winged messenger of the gods, who exists in the divine world, but also in the profane world and brings messages from one realm to the other. Well, you think, well, that's, many of the mainstream critics of my books have been ragging on me, let's say, because I wrote extensively about Harry Potter. And, I think one of them said I sounded like a stoned undergraduate, which I thought was pretty funny and maybe even true. But, you don't want to be too dismissive of that, what would you say, that the connection that we have to what's transcendent. The reason, like J.K. Rowling dominated the entertainment industry for a decade and produced artifacts worth billions and billions of dollars, books and movies that attracted everyone's attention. She filled a gap, a mythological gap in the popular culture. Well, those, so she was a messenger like Mercury. She's a messenger from the mythological domain, from the symbolic domain, from the domain of dreams and visions and art. And she translated that and pulled people along. You saw this icon glow, and it was Christ creating the universe. And so it'll probably take you a decade to figure out why that painting or that piece of art attracted you. Do you have any sense of it right now?
No, because it doesn't remind me of anything else. But I don't know if that's because of its artistic components, given that it's a very bizarre icon because it depicts the universe as this orb, and Christ is sort of painting it. It's just like anything I've ever seen, and it's such a simple piece of art, and it's very stoic. Christ is stoic on it, and the orb even has a face, and the orb is stoic. So I don't know if it's merely because it seems bizarre to me. I mean, I basically don't have a straight answer to that. It's just when going through icons, many of them I've recognized, many of them I've already sort of perhaps digested, but for some reason, this one in particular, I felt that I had to have it on my wall because when I look at it, it makes me feel something which I can't quite describe.
Well, that's what you want. When I bought hundreds and hundreds of paintings on eBay over the course of about a decade, and I looked at hundreds of paintings a night because you can easily do that on eBay. And I found at that time, which was quite a while ago, the best paintings I could find on eBay were always from Russia because there were huge collections of Russian Impressionism being distributed online for next to nothing. And I would go through paintings and I'd look at each of them. And what was interesting is even if I looked at 500 paintings in an evening or 1,000 paintings, which would be 4 pages of 250 paintings, so it's quite easy to do. Once I looked at a painting once, I could tell if I'd seen it before. All I had to do was look at it once, and then I'd have that sense of familiarity. I could tell if I'd seen them, because I'd sort them night after night, and some of them would reappear, and it was amazing that how fast you become familiar. But I would look for that popping sensation, and that's an intuition sensation. That's an aha sensation, and it indicates that you're learning something. You don't know what it is, but you're learning something right at that moment. It's like the punchline of a joke. And I would look at those paintings that would pop, and then I'd put them in a different collection, and then I'd print them out and go through them and see which ones attracted me and scrap the ones where I could see an obvious, what I felt was an obvious defect. But you can learn to pay attention to the call of the object. And it's a real mystery. It's an unbelievable mystery, because you have to ask yourself, well, why is that object calling to you? And well, it obviously is a psychological phenomenon, but the object itself is tangled up in it as well, especially when it's an artistic object, because an artistic object isn't just an objective object. It's got this weird, well, it's informed by the cultural context, but it's also got this weird subjectivity to it, because part of what it is you bring to it. Anyways, if you follow that, it leads you in all sorts of interesting places. And it leads you beyond what you already know, and it leads you to who you could be in the future. And so all of that's unbelievably useful, and it's nourishing for the soul, like music is. And so now you have an orderly room and you put a piece of art in it. Well, great, you have order and beauty, and that's a great combination. That's way better than pure order.
Yeah, and that's precisely why I feel beyond order is important, because you need both. Like, I've heard you say you can read each book separately, but they're both better together. And this is what I've found. And again, I don't want to just say this is the only chapter that matters. Obviously, it's not. But because of that, I've just felt, well, I can't logic the art. And the way you explain it helps, because when you listen to good music and your hair lifts up and you get goosebumps, you think, well, it's just the nerve cells are reacting a certain way, and that's why that's happening. But in this case, whether it's art that you've witnessed, there comes a point where you can't quite objectively logic why you're feeling this way.
Well, even if you do, like, let's say you do reduce it. You say, well, it's a nervous system reaction. Okay, fair enough. Well, why don't we delve into that a little bit? So why would your hair stand on end? Well, the answer to that is that it's a predator response. It's a prey response. Sorry. So, and it's, if you see, like, a cat's hair will stand on end when it sees something that threatens it. But it isn't exactly that the cat is threatened. It's more accurate that the cat is in awe. Now, it's sort of the physiological cat equivalent of awe, but nonetheless, it's the instinct out of which awe emerges. And so a cat sees something that makes its hair stand on end. Now, that's the origin of our instinct for awe. But then, well, art elicits that. So the predator, I would say that the predator elicits piloerection. The dragon of chaos in art elicits awe. And those are the same thing. They're one stacked upon the other biologically. And noting that doesn't diminish it. It actually makes it more mysterious. It's like, well, why would we have this awestruck / prey response to a piece of art? Well, yeah. That's a very difficult. I mentioned, I mentioned some of the reasons that might be. It's, well, we're reacting to the dragon of chaos. We're reacting to that which is beyond us. Mm-hmm. And it's not intellectual. It's far deeper than intellectual. It's instinctual. Even though we're reacting to the highest order productions of human intellect. So for me, noting the biology has always deepened the mystery rather than eradicating it.
So you're saying even when you dig through the objective aspects of it, where you say, okay, this is it's an evolutionary component we've developed, like many other things, you inevitably hit a brick wall even in that understanding of it, of to what end do we have that to begin with? It deepens the mystery.
Well, and how did it modify itself in that way, and why? Like, why did a fundamental response to a predator, this automatic response that makes you look bigger, say, why did that get transferred to the domain of art? How did that happen? It's such a mystery. And then it makes the artistic experience something that's unbelievably deeply embodied. Like, it's embodied in the reaction of systems that are tens or hundreds of millions of years old, at least tens of millions of years old.
Yeah. Well, and the fact
So,
that someone would change their life. I mean, there have been individuals in history who have changed their life from awe, right? Where I mean,
oh, yes, I think that's a very common. Look, everybody changes their life from awe. It's just that awe also comes in different sizes. So here's another example. Um, Maybe you find someone admirable, and so you copy them. And at the very least, you pay attention to what they're doing and saying. And as a consequence of paying attention to what they're doing and saying, you start to pick up their ideas and their maybe even their mannerisms, their mode of dress. You start to imitate. So a small dose of awe facilitates mimicry. And human beings are unbelievably profound mimics. It's the ability to learn from one another is in fact our ability to mimic. And so if admiration is a form of awe, attenuated awe, which it certainly is, then everything is motivated as a consequence of awe. And I think that's exactly right. Now, you can have magnificent experiences of awe, and artists are very good at providing that. Well, great artists are good at providing it. That's what makes them great. But it's there all the time. Even in a book that grabs your interest, that's also an attenuated form of awe. So it drives everything. This capacity for imitation drives virtually everything. There's an ideal, an implicit ideal that is beckoning to us constantly. We see it in pieces and we try to assemble it. And the thing we're assembling is our ideal future self. And that ideal future self calls to us as we develop. And art facilitates that process. It's crucial. And it's easy for rationalists to overlook this. And, I've seen accounts of religious experience, for example, and artistic experience. I think the most blatant example of this I saw was in Steven Pinker's The Language Instinct, which I believe it was in The Language Instinct. I hope I've got that right. And this is not a critique of Pinker's thought, global critique of Pinker's thought, but the chapter there is that he devotes to the artistic realm, the cultural realm, sort of an afterthought, as if it's an appendage, like a spandrel, a developmental excess of human intelligence. Whereas for me, it's exactly the opposite. It's what drives everything. It's what drives absolutely everything. It's our whole society is embedded in a dream, and art partakes of that dream. It's more dreamlike than our explicit utterances. It's closer to the dream and the vision itself. But that vision is there, and we're all participating in it. Otherwise, our lives are colorless and dead. And we need a heroic vision to motivate us because life is so difficult. And artists can remind us of that. And thank God for that.
Yeah, no, thank God for that. That's the thing, is that for a lot of people who are hyper rational, I've grown to become almost not sorry for them, but it's such a positive when you see art, when you see the value of it, that I think at the end of the day,
it's an arid landscape.
Yeah.
The pure orderly intellectualism. Well, and you think about a cathedral. Forget about the doctrine and the dogma. Just think about what's embodied in the building. You have this lattice work of stone. So it's the interplay of stone and light, which are two really antithetical entities. I mean, stone is virtually the opposite of light. It's so opaque and impenetrable. And yet A cathedral is this lattice that lets the light in. It's reminiscent of the forest and sunlight shining through the trees. All of that's packed in there, right? So we're arboreal in our evolutionary descent, and the cathedral reminds us of the primeval forest. And you can see that longing for the awe-inspiring nature of the primeval forest in the romanticism of environmentalism, and the worship of ancient trees, let's say. We can't cut down that grove. Well, and this is independent of the merits of that perspective. It doesn't matter. It's what it's reminding of us. And then the cathedral is full of color. The stained glass dapples the light, and so it's brilliantly colored. And in the medieval world, where there wasn't much color or much image compared to now, when you're saturated with that was jewel-like, right? And that's reminiscent in some sense of the city of God, that where everything, the roads are paved with gold and everything's bejeweled. It's that glow that you described that attracted you from within the confines of that piece of art. That's your soul manifesting itself externally. That's what makes it glow. And then you combine that with the music, and so you have a full aesthetic experience completely independent of the dogma, and that's completely irreplaceable rationally.
Well, I think even to add to that, you have the audio of it with the music, you have the visual. For us, at least in Orthodoxy, we also have the smell of incense. So you're sort of completely embodied in this really bizarre thing. And the fact that it's ancient is also amazing, because many people
Right.
Who are critics, there's this notion, especially in my generation, where the notion is that basically people spanning 200 years ago or back were basically cavemen, that we're so smart now and we understand the world, and people simply, used to write on yak skin and were dumb. And that is evidently not the case. But it's still nonetheless amazing to me when I discover it's not the case. The fact that it's ancient, I think, tells you everything. So it's just so profound. But I mean, to go on to another chapter, you ask people to reject ideology. And I think everything we've been talking to up till now, that's not ideology. That's something deeper. Ideology seems to be the surface level understanding of the world. I wanted to get your take.
Ideology is crippled religion.
Yeah, crippled.
Fundamentally. Like it drives all, as far as I can tell, and I explored this a lot in Maps of Meaning, because it's one of its main themes is exactly that exploration. Is we have a religious sense, which we've just talked about, grounded to some degree in our capacity for experiencing awe. Ideologies hijack that, and they do it they're idols in the classic Old Testament sense. That's exactly what they are. Is they're false idols, and they promise but don't deliver, and they are replacements for God. I saw this actually in Canada. Technically, I always had a suspicion that nationalism, for example, was essentially a religious impulse gone wrong. It's the attribution of the attributes of God. It's the attribution of transcendent assets to the state. So it's the misapprehension of the transcendent in the state. I did read a Gallup poll at one point that indicated that in Quebec, if you were a lapsed Catholic, you were many times more likely to be a separatist. And that's exactly what Quebec looked like to me, because it underwent its devolution from feudalism in some sense in the late 1950s, maybe the last European country to do so, and instantly replaced its profound Catholicism, profound and deep Catholicism, with 19th century nationalism, which was an ill fit from my perspective, because, look, if you're going to be oppressed, you're going to have to pick a better group than Anglo-Canadians to be, the carriers of your projection of oppression. We're just not that good at it. So, but that's the thing. Also, I think that the the rationalist atheist types don't quite get. They don't think of religious behavior as biological or instinctual, and so they underestimate its potency and the dangers it poses if it's not bound in the proper forms. And then it manifests itself in ideological possession. And yeah, that's chapter 6, I believe, abandon ideology. Um, it's a and a lot of Beyond Order is and Maps of Meaning as well. The first book I wrote is supposed it part of its goal was an antidote to ideology. I wanted to ground people in a more comprehensive view of the world, and to me that has 7 elements. There's the element of the dragon of chaos. This is all implicit in Beyond Order. There's the dragon of chaos. That's the unknown as such, the source of everything, whatever that might be. There's the natural world in its positive and negative forms, the social world in its positive and negative forms, and the individual in his or her positive and negative forms. And you need a representation for each of those domains to have a full narrative view, as far as I can tell. And there should be, you can tell a story by making any of those characters interact with any of the other characters. Man against himself, man against culture, woman against man, nature against culture. Those are standard narrative tropes, but you have to understand, you have to have a representation for all of those domains, positive and negative, to have a worldview that is unbiased in my estimation. And ideologies only provide a partial representation at best.
But they seemingly provide a quick answer to a complicated problem. And, this is what I've noticed. Definitely, it's been evident, especially in my generation, especially at my age. Jean Piaget, I think, talked about the messianic stage of development. I think it's very difficult for some people to comprehend or at least accept the reality that Team Red or Team Blue is not objectively good all the time. It seems very difficult for people. And, you see this with even some atheists, as you mentioned, who say, well, I don't believe in religion, but then their entire existence is posting about atheism or, doing something that essentially shows it's a religion. I'm curious more so about people in the middle who are apathetic to let's say, ideology or politics, who are now being forced into a culture that is forcing them to be political. In other words, cancel culture has presented itself in such a way where if you're a sports fan who doesn't like politics, now your sports are politicized. If you are a teacher and you like teaching Dr. Seuss, can't have that anymore. It's gone. So people are essentially, in many ways, being forced to become ideological. And I guess my question to you is, how can they resist the temptation to become ideological and in some cases radicalized by the presence of ideology, by the push of ideology?
Well, that's a good question. I think that your reference to the messianic stage, it's funny, virtually no one ever talks about that aspect of Piagetian theory.
Oh,
I've
really?
often noted that these great psychologists, they're stripped of their bizarreness when they're presented academically, and it's a real disservice because in the more baroque elements of their thought, that's often where the true genius lies. And Piaget's identification of that late adolescent messianic stage is brilliant, I think. But I've heard virtually no one ever talk about it. I certainly never encountered it in any of my classes.
Same here. I studied psychology, Dr. Peterson. I found out about Jean Piaget's messianic stage from you. So I certainly didn't hear about it from my psychology classes. So it's such a shame. It's tragic that's, a lot of these psychologists aren't being represented correctly. But I mean, to that
Well,
end,
it's not easy to represent a genius correctly, and it's also terrifying, because genius is terrifying by definition. Look, I think part of the advantage to Christianity is that it provides an outlet for that messianic urge. It attempts to spiritualize it, right?
Yeah.
Conduct your life, conduct the battle within yourself. So it's a real battle. It's a real struggle. It's maybe the ultimate struggle. It's a heroic mission. Get yourself under control. Integrate yourself. Get your house in order. That'll provide something that's sufficiently compelling if you do it seriously, so that ideology will look like a it will pale as a in comparison as an attraction. It just doesn't have the grandeur of that moral mission. Jung thought that, any sufficient moral effort was an appropriate substitute for psychotherapy. There's a moral discipline. Moral discipline is the antidote to ideology. And I do think, to begin with, to some degree, that has to do with genuine discipline. That's order. It's like, pick a discipline. And two of the chapters in Beyond Order are emphasize that, is to begin with, you discipline yourself in some direction. At least you learn how to devote your forces to a single end that way. Well, then after you've got yourself under control, I derived some of this thinking from Nietzsche, because that was his developmental suggestion, right? Not only for individuals, but also for cultures. He thought that Europe, the European mind, so to speak, had disciplined itself by insisting that everything be explained under the rubric of Catholicism, essentially. Everything had to be explained using that one explanatory system. And then once the capacity to manage such explanations was put in place, then that capacity could be used to solve other problems, and those would be scientific problems, let's say. I think that's a viewpoint that Jung adopted and extended in his analysis of the emergence of science from alchemy. But I think the same thing applies in your own life. It's like, well, pick something that you can do, and then discipline yourself, and then see what happens next, because something, you'll change as a consequence of that. Something new will attract your interest. There'll be some different element of that discipline that you'll be compelled to develop. And the best way of doing that, I think, is, well, to note what you're interested in, what's meaningful to you, and also to, in some sense, purify your thought and your perception. And you do that mostly by deciding and practicing it's forbearance of deceit.
Yeah. Well, it seems as though, ideology is not entirely bound at all by political aisles. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on conservatism, which has long, the culture wars, we've long criticized the left and being ideological, et cetera, et cetera. And, many Trump supporters might not be happy to hear this, but there is a fanatical element to the reality of what happened, for example, on January 6th with the supposed insurrection of the Capitol. I don't know if you witnessed that event, but those were supposed conservatives, but they were nonetheless, many of them, when arrested, were shocked and in disbelief that they were arrested. It was a very bizarre event. So I haven't heard you talk about it. I'm sort of curious to get your thoughts on what that meant. What did that mean, to where you have a shirtless shaman sitting in the Speaker of the House's chair?
Well, I looked him up, and he's clearly a narcissistic. He's a singular sort of character, and it isn't obvious what general conclusions you can draw from him. That character in particular. With regards to right-wing extremism, well, we're always in danger of entering a tit-for-tat environment between people who hold opposite viewpoints on virtually any potential axis of disagreement. It's very difficult for me not to conclude that this is instigated in large part by leftist intellectuals who are revolutionary by explicit proclivity and announce that constantly. And that I might be warped in my viewpoint by the fact that I've inhabited universities for so long, but it's hard for me not to lay the responsibility for such things at the feet of faculties of education, for example, which I think are appalling institutions in the main and responsible for a tremendous amount of cultural damage. Um, the question is, what's the best defense against extremism, let's say?
Mhm.
And again, I believe that that's individual development. I mean, look, you said that some year. How old are you now?
I'm 24.
Okay, so some years ago, you said you cleaned up your room, you got your house in order. Okay, well, why did you decide to do that? Why did that become motivating to you?
I felt as though it was necessary to basically becoming a man. I mean, look, I was inspired by you. I was inspired by your book. I was inspired by hosting you at UBC. And that was at an age, I believe I was 19 at that point. So it was at a pivotal age. And it was during an age when I spent most of my days playing video games. And I haven't played a single video game since. I'm unable to. It just, something during that period changed me. And I still can't describe what it was. I just knew that what I was doing was not sustainable. So maybe it is a delayed gratification to the fact that a dirty room will make me less productive and less able to function as an adult in society.
Okay, so you said that it was crucial in your transformation into an adult. Let's say you said man specifically. Well, we could say you decided to take responsibility for something that was real. Like a room is real, right? It's part of the world. It's part of the cosmos.
Yeah.
There it is, and it's yours. It's yours to do what you will with. And it's easy to denigrate that. Well, it's just my room. It's like, well, God only knows what you can get up to in your room. People can get up to some pretty damn dark things in their room alone or with their computer. That's for sure. So who knows how much good you could get up to? So you decided, by all appearances, or something gripped you so that you decided that you would take responsibility for it. So you put your room in order. So, and you said you were left with very little at the end of that process.
Yes.
So you
Yes.
got rid of a lot.
Yeah, I got rid of a lot because I found that, again, with my upbringing, I mean, just to give you a quick idea, I had grown up essentially in poverty in Greece. And when I came to Canada, I very quickly, I guess, became spoiled by everything we have here. And it sort of consumed me to such a degree where I'm covered in video games and different useless things that don't help me become a better person. So what I found was when it was all cleaned up, there wasn't much left. Not much
Right now,
left at
that's
all.
an interesting observation psychologically, because I would say too that that's also true spiritually when you clean yourself up, is you may find to begin with that if you get rid of all the dross, all the dead wood, there's like 5% of you left standing.
Yeah.
And that's really daunting. But then again, it's like a forest eradicated by fire. It's like it's the place where new growth can occur. And you need that burst of new growth in late adolescence because you need to catalyze your adult development if that's going to happen. Now, you can stay adolescent, and that does happen to many people, but it's not preferable. That's the thing. And I also think that's something that we don't really inform children of very well anymore in our society, that it's actually because we worship youth to such a degree. And it's too bad because it's actually better to be an adult than to be a child. I mean, childhood has that magic that I did write about in chapter 8, those intimations of immortality in childhood, and that purity and spontaneity. There's something remarkable about that. But all things considered, children are at the whim of all forces beyond their control. They have virtually no true autonomy. And that is something that you can have when you're an adult if you're organized, if you've organized yourself and you've become at least to some degree, autonomous, which means you're also not a puppet of your own whims. And
I
that
think
does
that's a
require
big
the
part of it. That's a big part of it for sure. Is being. I think you talked about this a lot, where the moment I realized and I became self aware of the fact that I am, whether emotionally or chemically, beholden to various vices that are not good for me, you sort of feel like a puppet. And you don't want to feel like a puppet. You want to feel like an active member of your reality. You want to feel actualized and feel like you're in control. So I think that was a major part of it, where I wanted to feel like I choose to do this. I am choosing to clean my room. I am choosing to buy art and put it up on the wall. It is not
right. Well,
because,
the critiques. Let's look at critiques of the patriarchy. Let's say, well, it's an overbearing tyrant. Well, yes, because culture is an overbearing tyrant, and why is that objectionable? It's because you're a puppet to the culture, and that's also true. Um, the culture is just as happy. This is a one-sided viewpoint, but it has its merits nonetheless. The culture is just as happy if you're a cog, because cogs keep the machine running. And so you're encouraged to be a cog. And if you don't want to be a cog, well, you're going to run into some resistance. And so you have to sacrifice your pound of flesh to become an acceptable member of society. And people object to that. And it is the sense of being a puppet that they object to, when they're, if it isn't just resentment and the refusal to take responsibilities. Like, I don't want to be a puppet of the culture. A thoughtless 9 to 5er, let's say, although that's a lot more desirable than it looked in the 60s, because it's been harder to obtain. So there's some real merit to that objection to order. But I still think the best way to stand up against that, let's say, is for you to become autonomous as an individual, rather than to sling arrows at the tyrant. And that's especially true in societies like ours, where the tyranny is quite ambivalent. It's like, yeah, you are the victim of the evil king, but look at all the video games and books and computers and food and opportunity and roads and schools and peace. And so you can't just object to the tyrant, because there's way too much ingratitude in that.
yeah. Well, and again, it's your choice, right? Like, I think part of my realization after reading your work is the fact that I grew up in a place where everyone is born there and everyone's going to die there, because there is no economic or structural way to move up. Whereas in Canada, we take so much for granted. And I think it is possible to move up. Yes, we have the video games and the food and the paved roads, but the food and paved roads is sort of the means in which you can, become your own king. So it's fascinating to witness that. I think, this sort of goes into our last point, which was the final chapter: be grateful in spite of your suffering. There's a notion in the West, and it does seem to be a Western idea. I never noticed it growing up in Greece, that you shouldn't suffer, that it's well, not that it's wrong to suffer, but the norm should be joy and happiness. And this is not necessarily the end. That's not necessarily the idea elsewhere.
Well, it's perhaps the norm should be joy and happiness. Wouldn't that be lovely if we could attain that? But the truth of the matter is that we're too vulnerable for that to be the case reliably. And the failure of joy and happiness can make you bitter. And a fair bit of Beyond Order is about bitterness and the terrible and resentment and the terrible psychological and social prices those emotions bear. To be grateful in spite of your suffering is not a justification for suffering. I mean, the less unnecessary suffering, the better, as far as I'm concerned. And it might be that it's worthwhile to suffer in the service of a noble goal, and that you could choose that, and fair enough. But there's plenty of arbitrary suffering, and I am someone who believes that by adopting responsibility and by attending to the truth to the best of your ability, you have the best shot at altering your destiny. But it's also painfully obvious to me that there's a random element in life that can strike you at any moment that's truly independent of your, at least by all human standards, independent of your moral stance. And that's terrifying. And it seems unbelievably unfair.
Yeah.
But becoming bitter about it isn't helpful. And so that last chapter is a call to courage, I would say, fundamentally. It's like the construal is that gratitude in the face of suffering is a form of courage, moral courage, and that it's appropriate.
Yeah. Well, it affected me, besides the art, the the chapter on art, the last chapter affected me profoundly because that call to courage is something that does make you somewhat Teflon to the suffering of the world. I mean, I've been dealing with my own issues where, because of what I do and being public and being active in the whole political world, I've been attacked pretty viciously by the media. And you know better than anyone what it feels like to go in for an interview with a mainstream journalist only to get skewered. And I've had a conversation with myself in terms of whether it's better to just walk away from everything. And that chapter in particular was very profound to the fact that I can't, to the fact that that courage and responsibility, it gives you a hill to die on. So I just wanted to say that that chapter in particular is was not only helpful to me, but I think helpful to a lot of people.
Well, I think it's the most troublesome chapter for me because I've had my troubles recently. Well, they're not far from over, and so has my family. Like we've been afflicted in an arbitrary way,
Yeah.
and in ways that aren't arbitrary too, and that we had a hand in as well. But it's very difficult, especially when you're experiencing extreme negative emotions, pain, anxiety, disgust, all of those things, to not, shake your fist at the sky and scream about the injustice of it. Um, but as far as I can tell, it doesn't do anything but make it worse. And and even when you are suffering arbitrarily, let's say, gratitude seems to be restorative. One of the things my wife and I do, she had a terrible bout with cancer, and then the aftermath of that surgical damage in the aftermath of the cancer that was life threatening on a daily basis for months and horrifying because of its uncertainty and, well, and a voyage through the land of disgust as well. Terrible. Um, you know, Before we eat at night, we say grace, and it's a ritual, and we need our rituals, that's for sure. But we use it as a constant reminder of what to be grateful for, and it's healthy. It's healthy, even in the face of horror. It's still healthy to do that. And I know it's a formidable task, and I think under some circumstances it's impossible. I mean, how how much if you see someone and they're in a certain amount of pain, you think that virtually everything is to be forgiven, in relationship to their behavior, because it can be absolutely unbearable, but it still doesn't seem to matter. It's gratitude still seems to be it's the right thing to strive for. And it's not a naive appreciation or some sense that, well, the world is just in its fundamental essence, or a naive optimism about the wondrousness of the cosmos. It's not any of that. It's a decision that it's an ideal to be strived toward, to be grateful, because it orients you well to other people too. You have more respect for them. You have more regard for them. you have more appreciation of them, and that that I think is all for the good.
Do you feel like it's in moments like that when you're saying grace? I've heard you mention this before. You've mentioned the narrative touching and colliding with the objective world. Has those moments ever evoked something like that? Can you find something spiritual in the suffering, or being grateful despite it?
I wouldn't say so much in the suffering. Like people have asked me about, the lessons I've learned from being in extreme pain constantly. And I don't have a nice, well, it's transformed my life and I'm so much better for having experienced it. It's like if I could dispense with it instantly, I
Yeah.
would. And I certainly wouldn't say that, well, what I've learned has been worth it. I wouldn't inflict this on my worst enemy for a day. Uh, and so, but having said that, um, the there is something that has been useful to me in the realm of gratitude, and I've had so much support from my family who've made tremendous sacrifices to help me, and from my friends who have gone, many of them, way above and beyond and continue to do so, what I would have considered reasonable, and I think beyond what I would have offered them. It's been a revelation of the goodness of other people's characters. And then even in the public realm, I've had so much support. So I would say, the suffering, my family's suffering has alerted us to the goodness of humanity as much as to the evil of existence. And so there is an antidote there that's both conceptual and real. The real antidote is, well, we've actually been the recipients of help,
Yeah.
generous help on multiple occasions, continual and remarkable, and and also experienced the same thing in the public domain. So I think more of other people now. I hold them in higher esteem than I did before. And so I'm not going to say that, you know, makes the suffering acceptable or justifiable or any of
Right.
that, but it's not nothing. It's saved my life in all likelihood, the help and the support for that matter, because it's encouraged me to keep going.
I wanted to close by asking you about closure. I've spoken to a few people. This past year could be defined in many ways, but on the global scale, it could be defined as the year of loss. A lot of people lost their life. A lot of people lost loved ones, whether it's due to addiction increasing. Um, there have been people who have had to, who have been barred from going to funerals, or have had to watch a funeral of a loved one over the internet through a live stream. You talk about how important closure is. You talk about how if you have a memory that's older than, I believe, 18 months or something like that,
Yeah,
that
18 months.
that there's something still alive there. There's something that hasn't been closed. How,
Yes, if it still haunts you, there's information there that you haven't incorporated into your psyche
how
explicitly.
there's so many people that I feel are grieving in the world. How do you feel, especially with people who have to, just the fact that they have to watch a funeral of a loved one over Skype or something? I mean, do you feel that there's going to be an increase in people who feel like they don't have closure? And if so, how can they come?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, in all sorts of ways. Marriages have been the same.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the first, and this would pertain, I suppose, to some degree to rule 3, which is don't hide things in the fog. Maybe it should have been titled, Don't Allow Things to Remain Hidden in the Fog. But in any case, ritualize it after when the opportunity arises. If you don't feel that the end of the chapter has been properly written, well, then you have to take whatever steps are necessary to rewrite it. And you do that in dialogue with yourself, but also in dialogue with the people who might share your grief. They're all going to be equally dissatisfied in all likelihood. You know, so if you couldn't attend the funeral of your grandfather, let's say, and that's left a gap, well, you could think about that for a while and see if there's something that you could do to address the gap. But I would also say you should talk to your other family members and figure out what you need to do collectively and individually so that you've buried the dead properly so they don't come back to haunt you. So,
Yeah.
and those rituals are very, very important to us. You have, you have to honor someone's passing, because that's partly how you indicate that you honor life. And since you're alive, you better honor life, or your life is dishonored, and then you have to live with a dishonored life, and that's not good. Then you're contaminated, and that leaves you uneasy, and that's not good.
Yeah.
So if that felt lack is there, I think it is vitally important to address it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good spot to leave it at. I know you're a busy man, and I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. It really means a lot, and it's great to see you again.
Thank you. Well, I was very engaged in our conversation, and I appreciate the time you took to read the book, and your you know your concentration on specific elements of it. Um, that's the best way to have a discussion, to see where it echoed in your own life. I'm very pleased that chapter 7 and the last chapter, because I would say that's my next favorite in the book as well, um, had a had a the desired effect, let's say, on you. I'm very pleased to hear that, and people seem to be responding to the book positively, which I'm really quite stunned by. Um, I wouldn't say what I've seen among the critical reviewers in the mainstream is a pronounced tendency to denigrate explicitly or implicitly the population that they think I'm serving, or that they feel
Hmm.
constitutes my readers and
Angry
listeners.
young
And
white men, is that the that
well,
that's the
yeah, that's usually the that's usually the phraseology. It's not true. That might be the primary demographic, but it's way broader than that. So it's simply not true. But even if it was true, it's like, well, why in the world would addressing, there's something reprehensible about providing useful information to that particular group?
they don't
So,
they don't seem to understand something, which is that you have prevented countless, if it is young men, from going down a very negative path. And I know that because every time I've hosted you in front of, hundreds, or if it's 1,000 people, I know the people in the audience. Like, as an organizer, they've spoken to me, and you hear it. Like, there's this notion about you that it's like, oh, angry young men are becoming angry because of Jordan Peterson. They don't understand that. No, you have prevented, a neglected group of people, or a neglected generation, from going down a very dark path. Like, you have done that. So it's very bizarre to me that they're doing that. And it just, well,
well,
it pisses me
my
off.
conclusion is that there would be just as much pleasure in seeing such people go down the dark path, because they don't deserve redemption to begin with. And that would also validate the a priori theories that led to their rejection to begin with. That's how it looks to me. I've learned a lot about populism from it. I saw this T-shirt down in Florida when I was there, Trump 2020, because fuck you twice. And I thought, that's exactly right. There's that, and that's a poke in the eye to the perceived elite who hold those opinions of contempt, and who discuss the basket of deplorables, for example, which is a phrase that I think probably cost Hillary Clinton the election.
Yeah.
And that contempt is, well, contempt is a terrible thing, and it's a dangerous thing. Um,
Yeah.
But the public response has been really positive, as evidenced by, well, the YouTube comments, which aren't known for their positive nature precisely, but also by the public reviews of the book. There's about 800 of them now on Amazon, and that's really what I'm looking at. And they're they've been more than I could have hoped for, and so hooray to that. And I do hope that the book is helpful to people. And my goal in writing it was to prevent that, to encourage an alternative to that degenerating, resentful, and nihilistic path, which I understand, and I understand the motivations for it and
Yeah.
the attraction to it, and even its capacity to harness that underused aggression. You
Yeah.
know, that's partly why the darkness is so attractive, is because that's a place where anger can find its home. But I would say, and that's better than naivety, I believe, but it's not as good as integration. And so that anger should be put to work as a disciplinary motivation applied to yourself. It's a powerful force, and it can serve you instead of you serving it. And that would be much, much better.